How do you define the environmental humanities, and why do you think this multidisciplinary field is necessary to confront the global environmental crisis?
Yeah, so the environmental humanities is an experimental multidisciplinary field. So it's more than an umbrella term for the many sub-disciplines in the humanities that have arisen over the last several decades, like environmental history, environmental philosophy. So it does more than just gather those disciplines together. Instead, it creates a generative space for experimentation, for creativity, for developing multidisciplinary approaches that bring together history, philosophy, anthropology with the natural sciences and the social sciences, and importantly with and into conversation with wider communities. So what the environmental humanities is or needs to be or is becoming, because I think it's very much a field in the making, is this more generative and experimental space that doesn't just rest with the kinds of traditional approaches of the humanities, but that tries to create something genuinely new. And a big part of that is refusing the traditional division of labour that said these are environmental problems and these are social or cultural problems over here, and we can neatly divide them up to the natural sciences and the STEM disciplines on the one hand and the humanities and social sciences on the other hand. At its core, the environmental humanities refuses that division of labour and says that our problems are much more complex and multifaceted than that, and we need to come at them, we need to develop new approaches to them that work across the natural and social sciences in innovative new ways that develop new kinds of approaches.
The jury has highlighted your central role in shaping understandings of extinction and the global biodiversity crisis. How do you think your work has contributed to this?
Yeah, I was delighted that the BBVA Foundation's committee highlighted that role of my work in rethinking extinction and what it means. And that really has been the core of all of my research, is an effort to make extinction and biodiversity loss meaningful in new ways. So I think that really is a key problem for us today, for contemporary society, is how to make extinction meaningful. And part of that problem really rests with our core assumption that extinction is common sense, that we all know what it is, and that it's a locatable event. And very often, of course, tied to the death of the last individual of a kind. So we think that when that last individual dies, Martha the last passenger pigeon, or Benjamin the last thylacine, when that last individual dies, we've sort of pinpointed the moment of extinction, because it really is about the death of all of the individuals of the species. And while that's a common sense understanding, it's really not helpful in many, many ways. So my work has really begun from trying to think about extinction differently, to think about extinction as an unravelling of worlds that begins long before the death of that last individual and continues to ripple forward in different ways long afterwards. So in making extinction meaningful, I guess I've really tried to highlight two main things. And one of them is that when a species disappears, what we lose are ways of being in the world, ways of life. And those are really ultimately unknowable ways of being in the world. But the more we try to know them, the more we sort of dive into, immerse ourselves in what is known about these disappearing species, the more remarkable and amazing I think each of them becomes. So I've tried to better understand the worlds of snails, how their chemosensory experience of the world, how they detect and sense the world through that chemoreception, how they follow the slime trails of other snails and actually don't just follow them but read them, draw meanings out of these mucus trails of other snails. How penguins, for example, home in on the location in which they were hatched and try desperately often to return to those places to themselves, bring forth another generation of creatures. How crows in Hawaii mourn, we think, and grieve for their dead. So I think when we tap into the ethological literatures, the biological literatures, we begin to appreciate, as the philosopher Margaret Midgley put it, that other animals are other worlds, that these are other ways of being that are disappearing, and we need to try and appreciate as best we can the sort of the fullness of the loss of these diverse ways of life. And so that's one side, I think, or one element of what I've tried to do. Another really important element of the story is thinking about these ways of life in relationship. And so thinking about extinctions, not just as the loss of isolated ways of life, if you like, but as the loss of a way of life that ripples out into the world to draw in others. And that's a biocultural process. So we could think about how the disappearance of a particular pollinator is felt by the tree species or plant species that relied on it. Or we could think about the way in which the disappearance of a particular species causes impacts on the livelihood or the traditional cultural practices of different human communities, indigenous communities perhaps. So these losses of these ways of life ripple out, and they ripple out across biological and ecological and cultural domains. And so we need to tell different kinds of stories about extinction that don't just reduce it to this sort of death of the last individual, but that attend to it as a much more drawn out, much more complex biocultural unravelling. And that's really what I've tried to do in my work.
How did you first become interested in nature, and why did you ultimately decide to do research in the environmental humanities?
So my interest in the environment really grew out of a deep sense as a teenager that we lived in a world that is lively, animated, even sacred. And so as a teenager, I looked a lot for answers to questions about our place in the world and what it means to live a good life. So I think many people who become very interested in the environment maybe talk about a background with an interest in birdwatching or naturalist pursuits. But my interest really came out of religion and philosophy. It came out of trying to ask those big questions about our place in the world. And so I looked around, I read widely, but I found really that wherever I looked, I was less interested in answers to those questions about our place in the world that were grounded in a kind of transcendent figure or transcendent source of value, and much more interested in looking to the world around us, looking to the natural world as a source of inspiration and wonder. And so that is really how I guess I was drawn to thinking about the environment, to valuing the environment and the natural world as a way of understanding who we are and a way of thinking through how we ought to live well in the world. So when I went to university, I studied philosophy and religion. I dabbled a bit in biology, but I really kept coming back to philosophy in particular. And I was lucky as an undergraduate to meet the really eminent environmental philosopher, ecofeminist philosopher, Val Plumwood. And she really inspired me and became a friend and a mentor. And then when I started my PhD research, I was lucky to be introduced to the work of the feminist science and technology studies scholar Donna Haraway, and then later on through Val Plumwood to her good friend Deborah Bird-Rose. And so those three women became my PhD supervisors, and I was lucky enough to work directly with Debbie and Val and to go and visit Donna Haraway for extended periods of time. And they really inspired me to think in new ways and to write in new ways. And although my PhD was almost 20 years ago now, and two of those wonderful women have now passed away, they continue to be some of the main inspirations, the main touchstones for my thinking. And in particular they should be touchstones for all of us in really thinking in ways that are philosophically deep and rigorous, but that are really empirically grounded and situated, and that try to grapple with the world, grapple with big questions in ways that are both particular and that think from the particular out into much broader, much more complex domains.
The jury has also highlighted that your work has contributed to reframing humanity's relationship with nature. In what ways would you say this is the case?
Yeah, my work's really sought to reframe humanity's place in the world, our understanding of what the natural world is in a range of different ways. But at the core of all of that work is a sense that we live in a multi-species world. And that really means that we need to get beyond telling stories just about humans, stories in which the rest of the living world is just a background to human dramas. This is the stage on which human culture and history and lives are played out. We need to sort of burst that anthropocentric bubble and instead appreciate that the worlds that we inhabit, and in fact all of us, our lives, are shaped in relationship with other species. So that we really need to take seriously the fact that other species, other living creatures, other non-living creatures and entities, geological forces, hydrological forces, that we're all shaping worlds together. We're all agents, if you like, in the shaping of worlds and in the shaping of one another. And then we also need to take seriously the fact that it's not just human lives and outcomes that matter, that other living beings and are at stake in the world too. And so when we do that, I think we start to tell very different stories about ourselves and about our world. And I think when we think about human life, for example, we need to appreciate that at a species level, we have, of course, been deeply shaped by our co-evolutionary relationships with all sorts of other species, with the landscapes that we've inhabited. At the level of our cultures and our communities, we're shaped in our ways of life, in our livelihoods, in all sorts of things by the species that we happen to live amongst and what we think of them and how we value them. And then, of course, as individuals, our lives are only possible through relationships with other species that provide the air that we breathe, the food that we eat. So in every way, really, when we think about human life, it is a multi-species project. As the anthropologist Anna Singh put it, human nature is an interspecies relationship. So I think we have to tell different kinds of stories. And over the last several decades, that sort of picture of the multi-species world and of human life as a relational achievement has been emerging out of a range of different disciplines, from archaeology and anthropology to the evolutionary developmental biology and history and philosophy. So this is not something that I have come up with on my own, but it's certainly a picture of the world that I've tried to contribute to. But where I see my real main contribution, my main effort, has been in thinking about what that multi-species picture of the world means in a time of extinctions. So what does it mean to understand ourselves as inescapably relational beings at a time when those relationships are breaking down, and breaking down en masse? And so that's really where my work, the work of my colleagues in the field of extinction studies, where our work is really centred to try to make sense of that relational breakdown, which we might think of as processes of unravelling, of unworlding, in which ways of being and also their many complex relationships are at stake. So that's been the core of my work, to study that really in its empirical detail. So I guess, unlike many other philosophers who ask those questions in more general or abstract ways, my work is grounded in field work. It's grounded in and the development of what I, with colleagues, think of as a kind of field philosophy. So we ask these philosophical questions through empirical case studies, through really engaging with particular sites in which particular species are disappearing, and trying to understand what those particular losses mean in their contexts. So that's, I think, essential is to answering this question of what extinction means and why it matters, is to take it up in its situated particularity through looking at particular case studies. But then from there, I think the other key element of my work and the other key contribution that I've tried to make in thinking about the unravelling of worlds is to say that this is a fundamentally ethical problem. So what is needed is not just the work of describing unravelling, but rather of finding ways of understanding what that unravelling means and how we ought to respond to it. And very often what we see when we look closely at these particular sites of species disappearance is that they are also sites of conflict. That if we think about our ethical obligations to other species that are disappearing, that's one set of obligations. We may also have obligations to communities whose livelihoods or traditional cultural practices are threatened. We may also have obligations around animal welfare and the species that are pulled into captive breeding programs, or the species who are culled to try and protect an endangered species. So very often when we begin to ask ethical questions in the field, we see that we have a range of competing ethical priorities. And so one of the core elements of my work has been trying to approach ethics in a way that's empirically grounded, that allows us to work through those competing obligations and claims, not to rest, I guess, with the simple idea that we have an ethical obligation not to let species go extinct, or that we have an ethical obligation not to cause unnecessary suffering to individual animals. I think both of those things are very important, but they can't be the end of the conversation. They need to be ingredients, if you like, in a more empirically grounded working through of particular sites of loss. And so my particular approach to extinction studies has been to do that kind of situated working through, and to insist that there's an important role for philosophy in doing this kind of site-specific, case-specific, grounded, situated thinking.
Why is it important to analyse the cultural meanings of species and extinctions in different societies? How can this kind of research contribute to improving efforts to preserve biodiversity?
So over the past couple of decades, as I've looked at more and more cases of extinction or species approaching the edge of extinction, I've become increasingly convinced that it's vitally important that we come at extinction through a focus on these particular cases, but also that we come at extinction in a way that appreciates the multiplicity of meanings and significances that any one extinction event has for different individuals that are caught up in it. So to put it simply, I guess I'm understanding extinction as something that is both radically singular but also multiplicitous. And what I mean by that is that extinction is singular in the sense that every extinction event is radically unique, that the death of the species Achatonella apex fulva, the beautiful Hawaiian tree snail, that the extinction of that species is something radically different to the extinction of the pu'uli, this beautiful honey creeper, a small bird that lived on the island of Maui. That those are different extinctions. They are different ways of being in the world that have been blotted out of existence, different ways of sensing, appreciating, living, of forming social relationships perhaps that are gone. But there are also different sets of relationships that are gone, as I've already talked about, different biocultural entanglements that are breaking down with the loss of each species. So each of those extinctions is singular, radically unique. But at the same time, each of them is multiplicitous. So the death of a Hawaiian tree snail, of a species of Hawaiian tree snail, is not the same thing to all of the different beings that are caught up in it. The native Hawaiian people for whom these snails are deeply culturally significant. They're understood to sing in the forest at night. They're embodiments of the goddesses in the forest. And so native Hawaiian people are experiencing the death of these species of snails in a radically different way to the conservationists who have come from elsewhere, from outside the islands, who of course care deeply about the snails but don't have that same cultural relationship with them necessarily. And of course the trees that once relied on these snails to clean their leaves are experiencing the death of this species in their own different way. So the significance of any one extinction event is multiple and takes different forms. And so I think we need to hold on to all of that multiplicity in our accounts of extinction. And a big part of that is attending to cultural difference, to the way in which the loss of species matters differently to different people. And that became particularly concrete for me in work that I did very early in my career, actually. The first field work I did after my PhD was in India, looking at the decline of the various species of vultures in India. And of course that impacted on communities in a different way. People who had traditionally collected the bones of the cattle that the vultures once ate to sell to the fertilizer industry, they could no longer do that. They could, these bone collectors, their livelihood was threatened. Other people were impacted on by the disease that was now spread as a result of the fact that the vultures weren't cleaning up all of these carcasses. But I was particularly interested in the Parsi community, who have traditionally exposed their dead to vultures in these large, in Mumbai at least, in these large towers of silence where they lay their dead out. And I remember a particularly impactful interview that I did with a woman who had taken her mother's body there to a tower of silence after she'd died to be laid out, and the vultures just weren't coming anymore. And so her mother's body was basically left to rot. And so for a people, a culture, a religion who for whom this last gift of one's body to the vultures matters. And this act of looking after the dead, of making them available to vultures, is an obligation that we have to the dead. For that system to break down really is a very particular way of experiencing the death of a species, the extinction of a species. And I realised in that conversation, in something that I had known intellectually but was seeing in a much more concrete way, that extinction takes so many different forms for the different beings, human and not, who are pulled into it. And so we need to try and hold on to that multiplicity for a range of different reasons, partly just because it gives us a thicker picture of extinction and of what it means and why it matters, but also because it highlights really profound questions of ethics and justice. When we appreciate that that extinction matters differently, that we're all drawn into it unequally, that some people are exposed in more significant ways, their cultures or their livelihoods are threatened by extinction in a way that other people are able to ignore or move beyond much more readily. We see that there are really important questions of ethics and justice here. And so attending to that multiplicity, the multiple meanings of extinction, is about foregrounding those questions of ethics and justice and holding them in the frame and beginning to think through how we respond to extinction well. And how we respond well has to be informed by that thicker picture of extinction. And of course, a big part of that is that the loss of species is not always something that communities regret or want to actively resist. That for some communities, the disappearance of species that matter to others is even celebrated. And sometimes the efforts to come in and conserve these species are greatly resented by local communities, and we have now decades of really important scholarship and activism foregrounding the negative impact that biodiversity conservation can have on communities. The problem with fortress conservation models that lock up areas of national park and exclude communities and prevent sometimes traditional practices and livelihoods. So I think when we attend to what the disappearance of species means, I think have to make room for the fact that for some people, for some communities, that disappearance of species is welcomed. And so we can then, through that awareness, begin to ask what kinds of conservation would work best. How might we imagine mutually beneficial, wherever possible, forms of conservation? So attending to that kind of cultural specificity, to cultural diversity within and around extinction events helps us to do conservation better, helps us to understand more fully the significance of extinction, and so to respond better.
Your first monograph told the stories of several endangered birds in a way that, according to the jury, defined a central role for the humanities in responding to the extinction crisis. How?
Yeah, so much of my approach to extinction was worked out in my first book, Flightways: Life and Loss at the Edge of Extinction. And I didn't really think about it in this way at the time, but in retrospect, I now understand that what I was really trying to do in that book was to develop a new approach for the humanities to extinction, one that draws on this sort of multidisciplinary approach to the environmental humanities that I've been talking about. So one that is not coming sort of solely out of philosophy or history or anthropology, but one that is blending different methods and approaches from those disciplines and bringing them into dialogue with the natural sciences and with local communities to understand what extinction means and why it matters in these different sites. So I have to acknowledge that a lot of my work on extinction really is indebted to early collaborations with people like Deborah Bird-Rose and Matthew Trelew and our Extinction Studies working group. And at the time that I wrote Flightways, that was a very active group where we were having conversations and working a lot of these issues out together. So I started work on Flightways thinking that it was really going to be a book about the ethics of extinction. With my background in philosophy, I guess I had imagined coming at extinction in a way that many philosophers already have, which is to sort of ask, why is extinction, especially perhaps anthropogenic extinction, a bad thing? How is it a moral wrong? And I guess I was hoping to develop more arguments about what is wrong with extinction and why we ought to try to prevent extinctions. But as I began to think through case studies, as I began to really explore species in decline like the vultures and many others, I began to see that, as I've already talked about extinction, each of these extinction events was radically unique in different ways. And that for me, what became much more important was not what became less important, let's say, was the development of more generalizable, overarching arguments about extinction and why it's a bad thing, and instead an effort to really attend to that specificity and to particularity. And as I've already said, a lot of why I think that is important is that it better approaches to conservation, more fuller, more thicker understandings of what extinction is and why it matters come out of attending to the particular. But there's another element that I guess also became central to my work in Flightways, another reason why I think that case study specific approach is so important, and that is because it opens into a space of bearing witness. And that's really where I arrive at the end of Flightways in the last chapter, which is thinking with the critically endangered Hawaiian crow, birds that, at least from what we can tell, seem to grieve and perhaps and gather around the dead, that there seems to be some sort of mourning going on for these birds with the death of their loved ones. So I began thinking about what it would mean to mourn not just for the loss of crows, but to mourn with crows, to mourn with these species that are disappearing. And so to think about, and part of that work, I argued, was to take up the work of bearing witness. And so that is really, I guess, has become a motivating factor in all of my writing. I hope that writing and thinking about extinction in the way that I do might make a difference in the world, that it might lead to the conservation, to better forms of conservation, but that it might help us to prevent some of these species from going extinct, or that it might help us to prevent other species from going extinct in the future. So there's definitely a kind of effective element to the work that I do, or an effort to make a difference in the world in that more practical way. But at the same time, I think my work has become motivated by this project or this effort to bear witness, that even if we can't do anything, even if these species are doomed to disappear, and that certainly does seem to be the case with many of the species that I've written about, that we still have an obligation to tell their stories. And that obligation is the work of bearing witness, of not turning away from loss and death. And Deborah Bird-Rose, I think, wrote most powerfully about this work of bearing witness, and argued that when we turn away from another who is suffering or dying, that there's a second violence in that disregard, not just the violence of having brought this species to extinction or to the edge of extinction, but the violence of disregard, of not caring, not bothering to pay attention or to even notice fully what that loss is. And so bearing witness is an effort to in some sense avoid that second violence, to be faithful to the dead and dying in some way. And so that's become another really key animating project of my writing about extinction. And that's something that really emerged out of Flightways for me and has continued to be something that guides my work.
How has your most recent work about the disappearance of snails further contributed to understanding extinctions in their social, historical and cultural context?
Yeah, well, this latest book was a change for me in many ways. I'd written a few books about endangered birds, and so I moved from birds to snails, which was one kind of shift, and I moved from writing books about multiple case studies where each chapter was a different bird in decline in a different part of the world, to writing one book that was all about snails in Hawaii, and actually more specifically on one island, on the island of Oahu. And I think both of those moves really mattered for me. So the first one, moving to really thinking in a place for a whole book, was an effort to slow down with something that has become increasingly important in my work, and that is attending to the cultural and political processes that are driving extinction events. So when you jump around the world a lot, thinking in a bunch of different places in a single book, it's really hard to slow down in the way that's necessary to really draw out how an extinction is a product not of just human activity in some generic sense, but rather of particular processes. In the case of the Hawaiian snails that I write about, processes of colonisation, of globalisation, of militarisation. The US military is a key player in the story of the Hawaiian snails. So I really wanted to be able to take the time to slow down with those historical and ongoing processes, and to move away from telling stories about the sort of anthropogenic extinction crisis that just says, this is a human-induced extinction crisis, to be able to say, well, yes and no, it's a crisis that's being driven by particular human processes, by particular political and economic systems and processes, and to draw out what they are in this particular case. And then the second move was from birds to snails, and that was a big change for me, a big shift, but something I really wanted to do to think more in a more detailed way about invertebrates. There's quite a lot of work in the world, and quite a lot of our conservation efforts are aimed at more charismatic species. And certainly I've written about less charismatic birds like vultures and crows over the years, but invertebrates really are the overlooked members of our planet, or one of the many overlooked members of our planet. They're not the charismatic mammals and birds who get most of the attention. But invertebrates make up 99% of the species of animals on the planet, and the vast majority of them haven't even been described and named by science. We don't know who they are in any sense. We don't even have a name for them, let alone any kind of information about what the species does or how it lives in the world. And they're disappearing at an incredible rate. According to best estimates, they're disappearing at least as fast, perhaps faster, than the mammals and birds. And so I wanted to really tap into this invertebrate bias, that, as many conservationists call it, the fact that we just don't know and don't care about invertebrates. And I wanted to explore what I think about in the book as the unseen extinction crisis, and to think about what it means to try to tell stories about species that we don't even have names for, but that are right at or perhaps even over the edge of extinction. Species that we discover only from their fossil remains, but that were alive in recent history, but we didn't even may have a name for them at the time that they disappeared. So how do we begin to think about and tell stories about and intervene in those kinds of extinctions? That was another key project for the book. And then I guess the other third real aim of the book was to try and push myself and to push the field of extinction studies to tell these kinds of stories in even more accessible ways. So all of my writing has tried to be relatively broadly accessible, but this book really aimed to be for a general audience. And so to challenge myself to try and develop ways of writing that pull on the natural sciences, on taxonomy, on evolutionary biology, and quite big and complicated literatures, but as well as pulling on philosophy and ethics and history and literatures of decolonisation and militarisation, to try and pull them all into conversation, but to do it in a way that would be engaging and meaningful to a wide audience. And that was itself, I guess, a challenge, a writing challenge, but something that I think, for obvious reasons, is increasingly important.
What are you working on now, and what future projects in the environmental humanities do you foresee for the coming years?
Yeah, so my current work is really pulling me in two main directions. The first is into the space that I'm thinking about with colleagues as the public environmental humanities. So, the public humanities has been around for a long time, but I think for a long time, many of us have been trying to think about what it means to do the scholarship that we do, to challenge and push ourselves to do it in more public-facing ways, certainly to speak to public audiences, but more than that, to do it in ways that are genuinely participatory, democratic, that create ways of knowing with wider publics, and that create the kind of knowledge and the kinds of interventions that are useful to wider communities. So in my own work, I guess I've been experimenting over the last 8 or 9 years in particular with all sorts of things, from museum exhibitions and documentaries to community storytelling portals, to try and find different media to think with publics and to tell stories with the public. So that's, I guess, one big strand of my work. And the other project that I'm excited about, that have recently started work on, is a project to think about a bunch of different threatened species that are scavengers and detritivores, basically animals and plants and fungi who take care of the dead, who consume and decompose and process, if you like, the dead. And I'm really interested in these threatened species that are also species that take care of the dead, and I'm really interested in the people who are trying to take care of these species who care for the dead. And so these practices of care at the edge of extinction, at the edge, the border between life and death. And I think these are really interesting sites empirically, but they're really also interesting sites philosophically. They're sites that I think might have a lot to teach us about how processes of death, decomposition and decay are vital and fundamental to living systems, but also more broadly about what it means to live well in a time of escalating death, escalating extinction. I think there's a lot to learn here about some really big questions. So that's a project I'm just beginning.
How do you view the challenge of the environmental crisis in today's particularly complex geopolitical context?
So I think the environmental humanities can only take on more and more importance in the context of this unsettling geopolitical processes that we live within now. In that kind of context, it's becoming increasingly important to attend to the cultural and political and economic processes that are driving our environmental challenges, but also to attend to the ways in which cultural and political systems are drawing different humans into these processes of biodiversity loss, climate change, etc., in different and unequal ways. So that's been obviously a key element of my work, and I think we need more work that really attends to the cultural and political and economic specificity of our environmental crises. I think one of the really big challenges of the geopolitical moment is the kind of post-truth era that we live in. The fact that facts are up for grabs in some sense and can't really be often can't be agreed on and are intimately tied to people's politics. And I think that there's a lot of careful, difficult work that needs to go into thinking through and inhabiting that space well in a way that doesn't alienate people, but that creates common ground for conversation. And so I'm inspired by the work of people like Isabel Stengers and Donna Haraway and Bruno Latour and others, folks coming out of science and technology studies and the environmental humanities who are thinking about how to create ways of knowing that are both empirically robust and that are also accountable to the communities and the worlds that they help to produce. And I think that's really what we need. And I think that's really difficult work, but it's work that refuses to accept that there are kind of clean, pure, objective ways of knowing over here, and then there are all of our kind of political problems, political points of view, our values over here, and that really insists that we understand processes of knowledge making as much messier processes of world making. So I think that in our difficult times, that work is more important than ever, and that's work that the environmental humanities is sort of uniquely placed to contribute to.
How can the environmental humanities, and in particular the kind of storytelling that characterizes your work, help to make people more aware of the environmental crisis and contribute to social and political action to confront this challenge?
So I think there's a vital role for the environmental humanities and for the kind of multi-species storytelling that I've been talking about in communicating broadly to a wide audience about biodiversity loss and climate change and other environmental problems, and communicating them in a way that draws out why they matter and how they matter differently and how they matter unequally. And from that foundation helps us to imagine more creative, democratic solutions to these kinds of problems. So I think that's the first thing that's vitally important. There's a practical element to really understanding the nature of these problems as complex natural cultural phenomena. But I think we need to do more than that, and the kind of storytelling that I've been particularly interested in developing in my work is fundamentally ethical. It's fundamentally about trying to draw audiences into proximity to disappearing ways of life, to open up space for people to learn and to become connected and to care in new ways. In the words of the philosopher Vincent Desprez, I think that this kind of storytelling is about learning to be affected. It's about cultivating the capacity to understand the world differently, and so becoming different in the process. So there's a kind of ethical and transformative charge, I think, or a transformative element to this kind of storytelling work. And I think we need to hold on to that, and we need to push and develop that kind of storytelling. At its core, though, I guess what is needed is not just to conserve this snail or this crow or this vulture. I think we're basically putting band-aids on problems. We're putting out spot fires, whatever the appropriate analogy is. What is really fundamentally needed, and I think this is a core mission, a complicated and maybe impossible mission of the environmental humanities, is the deep-seated culture change. I think what we are really seeing going on in the world around us is a product of a fundamentally dysfunctional way of understanding what human life is and our place in the world. And I think really what we need is to push back against that anthropocentric illusion that the rest of the world is just a resource for the playing out of human dramas, a resource for humans to use how they like. And that is that's not a kind of change that comes about overnight, that kind of culture change. It's not something that any one storyteller or set of stories is going to bring about. It's a big and ongoing project that pushes back against what have become dominant ways of understanding life, at least in the Western world and in many other parts of the world. And so I see fundamentally that that's the core project of extinction studies and of the environmental humanities. It is, as Donna Haraway, I think, has captured it simply, this is about storytelling for earthly survival. And I'm also reminded of really powerful words of Val Plumwood, another great philosopher who I've already mentioned, who said in one of the pieces she wrote towards the end of her life that humanity will go on in a different mode, or we won't go on at all. And I really think that's that's where we're at. That's the point we've arrived at. And so the fundamental goal of good storytelling, of environmental thinking in our times has to be about trying to understand what that different mode of human life looks like, and creating the resources, the creative methods, the modes of storytelling for getting us there.
How do you view the future of the environment and humanity's relationship to the natural world? Are you hopeful we're still in a time to prevent the worst scenarios of the global environmental crisis?
So I'm often asked about hope and whether or not I think we can or should be hopeful. And I guess I would say that hope is a dangerous and complicated proposition. It's dangerous because it can sometimes become an excuse not to act. We continue just to be hopeful, to kind of dabble in a kind of wishful thinking that things will ultimately work out. But it's also dangerous not to have any hope at all. So the complete absence of hope is totally disempowering. So I think we need to avoid the kind of two extremes of the complete absence of hope and this kind of naive optimism about the world. And in my most recent book about snails, I've tried to develop this idea of mournful hope, that is not abandoning the possibility of hope, but that is saying that any responsible hope needs to be grounded in an honest reckoning with the losses that have already taken place and those that will still take place, because no matter what we do at this point, there are losses that are locked in. There's climate change, there's a species that will still disappear, and there's very little that we can do about that, perhaps nothing that we can do about some of those changes. So while I think it's vitally important that we act, and there's time to achieve better futures than others, and that we should work towards the best possible futures, I think we need to have an honest reckoning with loss at the same time. And so I think we need forms of hope that are responsible and honest about our situation, rather than this kind of naive optimism. So ultimately, I guess where that has led me to is a notion of hope that is grounded in an effort to cultivate the best possible relationships with others that are still available to us. So that is ultimately what I am hopeful about, not about any kind of utopic future, which will never arrive, but rather I'm hopeful that we can make the kinds of changes to our understandings of ourselves and our place on the planet that we can, as communities, perhaps even as a species, take up the work of trying to cultivate better ways of living on the planet. So I think that needs to be our hope. It's I guess a more practical, mundane, day-to-day work of living well on the planet. And I ultimately don't think the kind of big visions, the big question of whether we can be hopeful, or what it means to be hopeful in some big, broad, general sense, is something that we can answer. I think all we can do is the best that we can do, cultivate the best relationships that we can, and see how things work out.
What does the reception of the Biophilia Award mean to you?
So receiving this award is a huge honour, and I'd really like to sincerely thank the BBVA Foundation for giving me the award, but I think perhaps even more importantly for creating the award, for having the foresight to imagine an award for the environmental humanities and social sciences. As we've been talking about, I think too often environmental problems are imagined as things that have scientific and technical solutions. And I think that the creation of an award like this is one part of a growing acceptance that our environmental challenges are much more complicated than that, and that the environmental humanities and the social sciences have really important roles to play. So I hope that through receiving this award that I can use the award to develop more fully the work that I do, and to promote the importance of the humanities in engaging with our many, many pressing environmental challenges.